Plagues and epidemics have ravaged humanity throughout its existence, often changing the course of history. Throughout the course of history, disease outbreaks have ravaged humanity, sometimes changing the course of history and, at times, signaling the end of entire civilizations. Here are 20 of the worst epidemics and pandemics, dating from prehistoric to modern times. 1. Prehistoric epidemic, circa 3000 BC. The discovery of a 5,000-year-old house in China filled with skeletons is evidence of a deadly epidemic. About 5,000 years ago, an epidemic wiped out a prehistoric village in China. The bodies of the dead were stuffed inside a house that was later burned down. No age group was spared, as the skeletons of juveniles, young adults and middle-aged people were found inside the house. 2. Plague of Athens, 430 BC. Remains of the Parthenon, one of the buildings on the Acropolis of Athens. The city experienced a 5-year pandemic around 430 BC. Around 430 BC, not long after a war between Athens and Sparta began, an epidemic ravaged the people of Athens and lasted for 5 years. Some estimates put the death toll as high as 100,000 people. 3. Antonine Plague, AD 165 to 180. Roman soldiers likely brought smallpox home with them, giving rise to the Antonine Plague. When soldiers returned to the Roman Empire from campaigning, they brought back more than the spoils of victory. The Antonine Plague, which may have been smallpox, laid waste to the army and may have killed over 5 million people in the Roman Empire. The epidemic contributed to the end of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period from 27 BC to AD 180, when Rome was at the height of its power. After AD 180, instability grew throughout the Roman Empire, as it experienced more civil wars and invasions by barbarian groups. Christianity became increasingly popular in the time after the plague occurred. 4. Plague of Cyprian, AD 250 to 271. The remains found where a bonfire incinerated many of the victims of an ancient epidemic in the city of Thebes in Egypt. The plague of Cyprian is estimated to have killed 5,000 people a day in Rome alone. 5. Plague of Justinian, AD 541 to 542. The Byzantine Empire was ravaged by the bubonic plague, which marked the start of its decline. The plague reoccurred periodically afterward. Some estimates suggest that up to 10% of the world's population died. 6. The Black Death, 1346 to 1353. The Black Death traveled from Asia to Europe, leaving devastation in its wake. Some estimates suggest that it wiped out over half of Europe's population. It was caused by a strain of the bacterium Yersinia pestis that is likely extinct today and was spread by fleas on infected rodents. The bodies of victims were buried in mass graves. The plague changed the course of Europe's history. With so many dead, labor became harder to find, bringing about better pay for workers and the end of Europe's system of serfdom. Studies suggest that surviving workers had better access to meat and higher quality bread. The lack of cheap labor may also have contributed to technological innovation. 7. Cocolistly epidemic, 1545 to 1548. The infection that caused the Cocolistly epidemic was a form of viral hemorrhagic fever that killed 15 million inhabitants of Mexico and Central America. Among a population already weakened by extreme drought, the disease proved to be utterly catastrophic. Cocolistly is the Aztec word for pest. 8. American plagues, 16th century. The American plagues are a cluster of Eurasian diseases brought to the Americas by European explorers. These illnesses, including smallpox, contributed to the collapse of the Inca and Aztec civilizations. Some estimates suggest that 90% of the indigenous population in the Western Hemisphere was killed off. 9. Great Plague of London, 1665 to 1666. The Black Death's last major outbreak in Great Britain caused a mass exodus from London, led by King Charles II. The plague started in April 1665 and spread rapidly through the hot summer months. Fleas from plague-infected rodents were one of the main causes of transmission. By the time the plague ended, about 100,000 people, including 15% of the population of London, had died. But this was not the end of that city's suffering. On September 2, 1666, the Great Fire of London started, lasting for 4 days and burning down a large portion of the city. 10. Great Plague of Marseille, 1720–1723. Up to 30% of the population of Marseille died as a result of a 3-year plague epidemic in the 1720s. Historical records say that the Great Plague of Marseille started when a ship called Grand Saint Antoine docked in Marseille, France, carrying a cargo of goods from the eastern Mediterranean. Although the ship was quarantined, plague still got into the city, likely through fleas on plague-infected rodents. Plague spread quickly, and over the next 3 years, as many as 100,000 people may have died in Marseille and surrounding areas. It's estimated that up to 30% of the population of Marseille may have perished. 11. Russian Plague, 1770–1772. In plague-ravaged Moscow, the terror of quarantined citizens erupted into violence. Riots spread through the city and culminated in the murder of Archbishop Ambrosius, who was encouraging crowds not to gather for worship. The Empress of Russia, Catherine II, also called Catherine the Great, was so desperate to contain the plague and restore public order that she issued a hasty decree ordering that all factories be moved from Moscow. By the time the plague ended, as many as 100,000 people may have died. 12. Philadelphia Yellow Fever Epidemic, 1793. When yellow fever seized Philadelphia, the United States capital at the time, officials wrongly believed that slaves were immune. As a result, abolitionists called for people of African origin to be recruited to nurse the sick. The disease is carried and transmitted by mosquitoes, which experienced a population boom during the particularly hot and humid summer weather in Philadelphia that year. It wasn't until winter arrived, and the mosquitoes died out, that the epidemic finally stopped. By then, more than 5,000 people had died. 13. Flu pandemic, 1889–1890. In the modern industrial age, new transport links made it easier for influenza viruses to wreak havoc. In just a few months, the disease spanned the globe, killing 1 million people. It took just 5 weeks for the epidemic to reach peak mortality. The earliest cases were reported in Russia. The virus spread rapidly throughout St. Petersburg before it quickly made its way throughout Europe and the rest of the world, despite the fact that air travel didn't exist yet. 14. American polio epidemic, 1916. A polio epidemic that started in New York City caused 27,000 cases and 6,000 deaths in the United States. The disease mainly affects children and sometimes leaves survivors with permanent disabilities. Polio epidemics occurred sporadically in the United States until the Salk vaccine was developed in 1954. As the vaccine became widely available, cases in the United States declined. The last polio case in the United States was reported in 1979. Worldwide vaccination efforts have greatly reduced the disease, although it is not yet completely eradicated. 15. Spanish flu, 1918–1920. An estimated 500 million people from the South Seas to the North Pole fell victim to Spanish flu. 1/5 of those died, with some indigenous communities pushed to the brink of extinction. The flu's spread and lethality was enhanced by the cramped conditions of soldiers and poor wartime nutrition that many people were experiencing during World War I. 16. Asian flu, 1957–1958. The Asian flu pandemic was another global showing for influenza. With its roots in China, the disease claimed more than 1 million lives. The virus that caused the pandemic was a blend of avian flu viruses. The total death toll was more than 1.1 million worldwide, with 116,000 deaths occurring in the United States. 17. AIDS pandemic and epidemic, 1981 present day. AIDS became a global pandemic in the 1980s and continues as an epidemic in certain parts of the world. AIDS has claimed an estimated 35 million lives since it was first identified. HIV, which is the virus that causes AIDS, likely developed from a chimpanzee virus that transferred to humans in West Africa in the 1920s. The virus made its way around the world, and AIDS was a pandemic by the late 20th century. Now, about 64% of the estimated 40 million living with human immunodeficiency virus (HIV) live in sub-Saharan Africa. For decades, the disease had no known cure, but medication developed in the 1990s now allows people with the disease to experience a normal lifespan with regular treatment. Even more encouraging, 2 people have been cured of HIV as of early 2020. 18. H1N1 swine flu pandemic, 2009-2010. The 2009 swine flu pandemic was caused by a new strain of H1N1 that originated in Mexico in the spring of 2009 before spreading to the rest of the world. In 1 year, the virus infected as many as 1.4 billion people across the globe and killed between 151,700 and 575,400 people, according to the CDC. The 2009 flu pandemic primarily affected children and young adults, and 80% of the deaths were in people younger than 65, the CDC reported. That was unusual, considering that most strains of flu viruses, including those that cause seasonal flu, cause the highest percentage of deaths in people ages 65 and older. But in the case of the swine flu, older people seem to have already built up enough immunity to the group of viruses that H1N1 belongs to, so weren't affected as much. A vaccine for the H1N1 virus that caused the swine flu is now included in the annual flu vaccine. 19. West African Ebola epidemic, 2014–2016. Ebola ravaged West Africa between 2014 and 2016, with 28,600 reported cases and 11,325 deaths. The first case to be reported was in Guinea in December 2013, then the disease quickly spread to Liberia and Sierra Leone. The bulk of the cases and deaths occurred in those 3 countries. There is no cure for Ebola, although efforts at finding a vaccine are ongoing. The first known cases of Ebola occurred in Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1976, and the virus may have originated in bats. 20. Zika virus epidemic, 2015 present day. The impact of the recent Zika epidemic in South America and Central America won't be known for several years. In the meantime, scientists face a race against time to bring the virus under control. The Zika virus is usually spread through mosquitoes of the Aedes genus, although it can also be sexually transmitted in humans. While Zika is usually not harmful to adults or children, it can attack infants who are still in the womb and cause birth defects. The type of mosquitoes that carry Zika flourish best in warm, humid climates, making South America, Central America and parts of the southern United States prime areas for the virus to flourish.